What I intend to do today is to take you through quality aspects. But before we do that, we just start and explain a little bit about nabim. Nabim is a trade association representing UK flour millers. We have 30 members operating 51 mills. There are only 2 mills not in our membership, a medium-sized and a small one, and they're situated throughout the UK. We're a fairly long-running organisation. I've been there for quite some time, and collectively we are the biggest user of quality wheat in the UK. Our product, flour, everyone thinks of that as going to bread. Well, yes, the majority does go to bread, probably followed by biscuits, cakes and pastries, but there are many other uses, particularly with batters, coatings, thickening agents, even in soups. It really is the universal food. I heard a fact not so long ago that in every month more people buy flour-based products than buy toilet rolls, but it's probably best not to think about that too much just before lunchtime. If we move on, our membership are very varied. We go from the biggest mills like Solent Mill and Whitworth's Mill over the way at Wellingborough down to some of the smallest mills. We don't include windmills and watermills, but production is massive. And those big mills are operating on a 24/7 basis. Most of those big mills will operate for 6.5 days a week, and that has a big driver on quality requirements because everything going in must be fit for purpose. You can't shut down, you can't stop. And perhaps the important thing for us has been the change in the sector. A number of mills and number of companies have showed a steady decline. They've plateaued off fairly recently, and indeed you might argue there has been a degree of recovery. In terms of location, you can see where wheat is grown. Mills are spread out. Some are very close to sites of production, others over the other side of the country. And of course, mills tend to divide into 2 key locations, those built around ports, places like Tilbury, Southampton, Liverpool, and those more traditional ones a bit more inland. And in terms of our contact as a trade association, we work very closely with others, plant breeders right through to HGCA. If we turn now to quality, I mean, the big problem with quality is how do you define quality? And I'm going to really focus you, besides the 2 very traditional comments there, quality is quality rather than quantity. Well, that's a very topical subject because, of course, everyone's talking about increasing yield, and we would say yield's all very fine, but you've got to put it to some use, and it's very important that the national crop maintains its quality. And the middle statement is perhaps the one to focus on. Quality is something that our customers require as an absolute given. Bakers also produce on a 24/7 basis. Every day they bake thousands of loaves. Those loaves must go into the shop looking the same every day. The housewife must be satisfied that when she takes a slice out, it's going to butter in the same way, it's going to make exactly the same sandwiches and product. There can be no variation. And of course the challenge there is farming is driven by variation in weather, and yet somehow at the end of it we have to have no variation. I thought we would have a slight advertisement. That's a chap called Stephen Craggs. He was this year's winner of the Milling Wheat Challenge, which is a competition nabim runs with HGCA to find the best milling wheat grower. Stephen really fits this very well. He farms up near Sedgefield, and anyone who knows that area knows that the climate is not kind. It's a very harsh climate. Stephen is one of those unusual characters who grows continuous wheat. In fact, he grows continuous milling wheat. Probably a change is in store for him very, very soon with the CAP reform. But interestingly, despite that climate and that rotation, he gets 90% plus meeting Group 1 full spec. Now, he can only possibly do that by a total commitment to quality. And I won't go through the detail of his business, but there is not an aspect of his business that we saw that isn't driven by quality. The competition, by the way, will be running again next year. We will be starting the process just before Christmas, and I would urge anyone here present to enter. It's a good competition. It's great fun for both those who enter and those who judge. We have found some amazing producers. In the last 4 years, we've had 16 really good finalists and 4 excellent winners. I mentioned about our customer, and that really just underlines the point that those bakeries are producing constantly. They want good wheat going in. Very difficult to illustrate to you good wheat, but that's the sort of poor wheat off to the right that we saw last year, good quality wheat the other side. And of course that translates roughly into the sort of loaf there on the left compared with the one on the right. Now, quality has 2 aspects, and I'm going to divide the talk into those 2 aspects. The first one is the food safety quality. Food safety is an absolute in our business. Without that, we are nothing. And a company that failed would not only lose its customers, but it would lose its reputation and be disastrous. We often think, as millers, that perhaps farmers don't pay enough attention to that first one. It is very important. The second one is the contractual quality. That's the one we've already heard about, the ability to get protein levels, Hagberg's, specific weights. But it's very much the 2 taken together that determines what can happen to our product. Now, any talk today wouldn't be worth its weight without mentioning the assurance schemes. The assurance schemes are very important to us because they give due diligence. They show that we, as processors, have sourced grain that meets certain standards. A lot of farmers feel that there should be a sort of financial reward to this. I would say get real in some ways. That is a given for us to show due diligence. It's not rewarded per se from retailers, other than the fact without that they probably wouldn't buy from us. Perhaps in order to understand quality, we've got to look at what happens when we don't meet it. And I've got a couple of slides now to examine the rejections that we see at flour mills. And if you look through them over the years, there is variation, but they're very low. I mean, last year we had 4% in a bad year, rising to 2008, 6%, but generally very low. Of course, the figure on the right is the translation to loads, because grain generally arrives in 29-ton dollops in a lorry. There's about 185,000 of those into mills, and you can see the effect of what happens at our end. Last year, more than 7,500, almost 7,500 loads got rejected. Doesn't look a big number if you even it out over the mills, but of course every rejected load causes a problem. There's a backup of lorries, but more importantly, the grain that was expected that day hasn't arrived. And in a 24/7 operation with not a lot of storage capacity, if you get a couple of those in the day, you begin to have problems. If you look at the reasons why we get them, well, obviously the biggest there is outside specification, more than half. The rest divides down. Wrong variety has decreased in recent years. Hopefully it will always stay that way. The mycotoxin one, the purple one there, the high DON, is variable. Last year it was 8% of the rejections, and the rest cut down into fairly small values, with an other that I haven't mentioned, which is the one at sort of 11 o'clock onwards. And again, if you divide those down into loads, you'll see that varieties not meeting spec, and these are ones that get rejected, not ones that get financial penalties, is still a very significant number. Some of the others are lower, but if we take Ergot at the bottom, it's an increasing issue, a bit like the mycotoxin one, where consumers are so focused on it that it gives it an extra importance. With our friends here from HGCA, we really couldn't fail to mention that there are good reasons for you to know about both of these, not least because sight of these are required under Red Tractor. The first is good storage, because however good the crop is before it goes into your barn, it's not going to remain that way if storage is poor. The other one is the sampling guide, which is the one that's been launched today. That is an extremely important one for us, because I think many of those rejections would have been prevented if at loading you knew exactly what you were sending compared with what arrives. And there's a whole series of things we could discuss around good sampling, but perhaps the most important one is having a really good store mapping idea. You can take samples as they go in and you can aggregate them and you'll have a picture of the totality of what's in that bay. But unless you know where it is, perhaps there's a problem. And at the extreme example, you know, if you harvest all your headlands first to make harvesting easy and tip them at the back, well, you're bound to get a difference between what's at the front and what's at the back. Right. If we go through them first of all, and although this one might be more contractual, I have put it amongst the food safety ones, admixtures and screenings. And just to go through them. Admixtures tend to be where we have other grains in there, be they broken grains or other cereals. Screenings are where we get things that really shouldn't be there. And they range from chaff at one end through to metal objects. I mean, these should definitely not be there. Plastic, animal droppings, stones, mud balls. Lead shot is an increasing one, both as lead and steel shot. How on earth that gets there, since you're not supposed to be shooting in stores, we don't know. Concrete is perhaps a bit more explainable, but not something we want to receive through the door. And occasionally we do see dead animals. And there is a maximum set for screenings at 2%. Screenings, of course, could be removed very easily if there was a screening process at farm. Just a few illustrations, but I'm sure you know exactly what chaffy wheat looks like. Pesticide residues, again, a big topic in its own right. We look for these. There's an HGCA project that looks for these each year. Some are more important to us than others. We've been concerned in recent years whether there was a risk from, as it were, the more general agrochemicals, the fungicides that tend to go on from growth stage 59. The great news is, despite our customers asking about them, we haven't been able to find them. And of course, the majority go on relatively early in the life of the crop. Plant growth regulators, well, they're important because, of course, residues have been picked up in some situations. They go on possibly outside of their window, and I think most of the problems do occur where they are slightly outside of their application window. Glyphosate goes on quite late in the life of the crop and is another one where retailers, particularly those who have seen some of the issues from elsewhere in the world, rather focus on. And then, of course, there are the storage insecticides. We always seem to pick up some of the growth regulators and some of glyphosate, but generally they are not issues. But the key message for all of these is proper application, not going outside of the window, and obviously not exceeding doses, are the way to keep the situation as it is. Most farmers don't think about heavy metals, but a lot of our customers do, and that's particularly because the EU Commission set maximum level for them. And they've recently been going through a review process for arsenic, cadmium and lead. The source of all of those, putting aside our industrial heritage, comes from soil and soil type. And in the UK, we're blessed with soils that generally don't have large amounts of them. The range and the numbers found, by the way, are from the annual HGCA study. And cadmium is the one that we've been most interested in, A, because of the review, but we were also aware that some soils are relatively cadmium rich. And since the EU were considering lowering the maximum level from 0.2 to 0.1, there could have been a risk for some producers in some areas. In fact, they've stuck with that level, so it's not an issue. But again, you know, how many farmers do think about the heavy metal level in the grain they're producing? Microbiology is an interesting one because a lot of it is determined by natural causes, soil, water, animals and birds. But there is the potential of contamination in store. Fortunately for all of us, there are no legislative controls on it, but millers do an annual survey of flour to look at the microbiology. We do it mainly so that our customers can have a degree of reassurance. But I suppose the big reason for putting this on is, although a lot of the bacteria that will be encountered come naturally, some can be avoided. Animals, dogs and cats should not ever be in a grain store because that's the biggest situation. And I personally have seen farmers' dogs wandering into the edge of the grain. The other one that's worth watching, although slightly less easy to control, is the transfer of mud at loading. If you're front-end loading and it's a muddy surface and then you're driving back into the grain, that is another potential source. Allergens. Allergens to us as food producers are really high on the list because consumers are very, very aware of these. Most of them are likely to occur at the transport stage. Nuts, mustard and lupin are the ones that stand out for us. Soya. Soya is very important because, of course, it is carried in the same lorries. And it's very important that when lorries turn up on your farm, there mustn't be anything in them. There's certainly no whole soya beans. Perhaps the biggest risk, soya meal. If it's a damp day and it's stuck to the walls of the lorry, not at all good. And taken to its lowest level, no one should be eating peanuts anywhere near your grain store. And the other important one to us are insects and mites. And again, HDCA have a really good coverage of this in the storage guide. They're an absolute no-no for two reasons. Mites often are a result of poor storage and bring with them an odour issue. Insects, just their physical presence, and even bits of dead insects, if they get through the system and get baked, you know, it really does not look good. Most millers are absolutely on their mettle looking for insect traces at intake. But back to good storage, and much of what I've said is about good storage. We move on now to mycotoxins, and I could spend the whole of the afternoon, I suppose, talking about mycotoxins, but I'm not going to because I think that's covered elsewhere. Symptoms in the field are pretty obvious, symptoms in the grain fairly obvious, and last year we did see quite a lot more of those pink grains than we would have anticipated. I think mycotoxins have become the major food safety issue for us simply because retailers are aware of the issue, and I suppose also because it's not that number of years since the EU brought in the legislation, and all of us throughout the chain are trying to cope with what that means in terms of removing high levels, not offering them for sale, and making sure that, in our case, end products are getting through. Not getting through, rather. And I've put the maximum levels there, and the reason I've put the maximum levels is it's all too easy to focus on the raw wheat level, which is the one we buy at, but you mustn't forget that the ones that we have to achieve for flour and for certain other baked goods, finished products, are much lower. Now, gristing grain can remove that, but of course if you were to have high levels on sequential loads, you would get into a problem. And there's a particular problem for people manufacturing certain things like baby foods, but also some of the drier biscuits. You do not have the sort of water dilution effect. You do not have the freeboard of even making to a conventional flour. So it's a very, very sensitive issue for us. And if you look at the DON trend, there is great variation. Last year, We didn't think initially it would be that bad. We had much bigger problems from specific weights, has been said. But if you aggregate the last two columns, and that's how we tend to look at the risk, there was a tangible risk, and it did work out that way. Particularly at the end of the season, we were seeing more loads coming through with Don than we would have wanted to. And it comes back, I suppose, again to good sampling, because the problem for all of us is within a given field you might have little patches of Fusarium head blight, which means in the barn they'll be distributed irregularly. Even in a lorry load they can, and yet we have to work under that legislation. So good sampling, good mixing. If that grain can be mixed rather than just tipped and then loaded off, so much the better. And those farmers who achieved better quality control were those who had the facility for mixing, even through the dryer, and those who had some way of either sieving, or indeed some farmers we know even have colour sorters. It gets the problem reduced. The other mycotoxin, which one can cover sort of more rapidly, is Ochratoxin A. Ochratoxin A, fortunately, is a problem that's decreased. And I'd like to think in this gathering, it's decreased for two reasons. One is Red Tractor standards, and the other one is the storage guide that HGCA produced. Because ochratoxin generally comes from poor storage, particularly where you've got leaky roofs, moisture getting in onto the grain, and you get a hot spot formed, and in that hot spot you get Ochratoxin A. An easy one, an absolute easy quality to control issue, because you make sure that the store is in good order and not leaking, and you're monitoring for any temperature or smell changes. The final one is perhaps the most topical one, Ergot. Ergot's been with us for, well, as long as mankind's been growing wheat and rye. Generally good control. Millers reject at presence. So you shouldn't, if you see it, it shouldn't even be offered. The reason I focus on this is the EU Commission are taking a great interest in this one. They have a bit of a checklist of having legislation for all of the mycotoxins. This is, as it were, the latest on the list because it's commonly found. They will be setting a legal limit. It doesn't actually have a legal limit for the fruiting bodies, the scrotal bodies at the moment. There's an intervention standard and there's a codex standard. They will be bringing in the intervention standard, which is 0.05%, which is 5 grams per kilo. Generally, we reject at a much, much lower rate than that. So this shouldn't be an issue for the industry. The bigger issue will be because in the last 4 years, we've been able to look for the active ingredient, as it were, the ergot alkaloid. And I was at a meeting in Brussels last week. They clearly want to set levels based on those mycotoxin alkaloids. The thing that stops them at the moment is, or two things. One is we have little knowledge of what any numbers would mean. More importantly, there is no rapid test. Without a rapid test, you would disrupt the whole of the grain chain. But the important thing is making sure that those sclerotia or loads with sclerotia in are not offered. Right, if we move on now to the other area, which is the contractual quality. What is it we require? Well, in some ways, Ellie has gone through those. For top quality bread, we're looking through for 13% protein, 12.5% for a slightly lower level. A good Hagberg falling number at 250 and a good specific weight at 76%. Moisture, we're quite focused on, it's 15%. Generally not an issue for us, simply because it's only in really wet years that things get bad. And most millers are fairly flexible if they know it's not been stored. The issue is where high moisture, long storage periods. For biscuit wheats, it's slightly different, lower protein, lower Hagbergs, lower specific weights. The important thing with biscuit wheats, though, and I'll come into this again a little bit later, is that the rheology is important. Fortunately, Group 3 wheats are only Group 3 wheats because the rheology of the variety is such that you get low resistance and good extensibility. But that's what we're looking for. And of course, if we go through them one by one, protein, well, I showed that slide at the beginning. A good protein loaf is obvious. Protein, though, in terms of contractual terms, is a very difficult one because we measure nitrogen and then do a calculation of what that means in terms of protein. And in a way, it's a rule of thumb because the important thing is the quality of that protein, how the gluten itself is, and more than that, what the gluten is made up of. The problem is there is no quick test to find it out. So that rule of thumb is the one that's sort of tried and tested. It can lead to problems. For some millers, even taking in some years at a particular level, you can have bad performance. And last year, we did see bad performance. It's something that you tend to see at the start of the season, but that's mainly because any changes, millers are not quite used to them at that stage. Moving on to specific weight, well, you hardly needed a picture of shriveled grains with specific weight. And for specific weight, I covered it in the question, once you get that low-sized shriveled grain, it's much, much harder to get the endosperm out. And in fact, you get out less of it. So you're buying in more grain. You're probably buying in 110% of the grain to get exactly the same amount of flour that you were producing before. You're using a lot more energy because it requires harder milling, and at the same time you're trying not to have the risk of discoloured bran, because the one thing that bakers will not buy is flour that is not white, and you are losing protein. So all in all, it's a real big problem, one we've coped with until last year, and it was an awakening for everyone. On the left are the sprouted grains, and sprouted grains are the worst of the Hagberg falling number situation. Hagbergs, of course, you've got high amylase there, and you will see you get this sort of stickier dough that leads to that sort of look, which again is totally unacceptable. And again, Hagbergs are very driven by the weather. Some varieties, of course, are earlier and have less risk, but as soon as you get in the later period and moisture and the start of germination, Hagbergs fall. They're always highest at the beginning of the harvest period and lowest at the end. The big challenge for millers and farmers together is the variation in varieties meeting the criteria. And if you look at the high quality bread making spec that I put up a few minutes ago, you'll see last year and this year contrast greatly. Last year we were getting 3% meeting full spec. The fact that as millers we carried on going with that level says a lot. We did have to buy in a lot more foreign wheat, German wheat in particular, but not good for anyone. This year it's returned to 37%. An average over a period is generally around the 40%. Perhaps the big question there is how do we manage, really, that we grow this milling wheat and yet so little of it, or relatively low proportion of it, meets full spec usable quality. We get by gristing, but the big challenge for everyone is how can we get more of it up at the full spec level. The medium quality one is slightly different, of course, because we're looking at lower protein levels and lower levels of everything. 16% in the bad year, contrasting with 58% this year. And by the way, I thank my HGCA colleagues, and particularly Jack, for these Venn diagrams. And for biscuits, a similar picture, 9 last year, 68 this year. In a way, the biscuits tend to be less affected by poor conditions because, of course, the requirements are a bit different. Back to my summary, and I make my summary with the Milling Wheat Challenge trophy to remind you that the competition is running. But the summary really is a very simple one, that millers will always need quality grain. There is always a ready market for you. The important thing is to understand that market. Big problem in the the UK grain chain is that millers and farmers are separated by a middle link in the chain, merchants. But merchants will hopefully get you to come to flour mills. You're always invited, both individually via your local mill and through the Meet the Processor events that we run with HGCA, to visit your local mill. Whilst the mill itself and the process is very interesting, the more important part is to understand what that miller requires. Different mills have different requirements. Some will specialise in the standard varieties. Others will perhaps offer contracts for older varieties, minor varieties, whatever. But unless you really know what they want and what you are really good at growing, you've sort of missed a trick. And my final point is, be like Stephen Craggs, this year's winner. Absolute focus on getting quality and doing quality in everything that takes place on your farm. And with that, gentlemen, thank you very much.